Last month, many of you enjoyed the Reverend Brian Kiley's reflections on his experiences with UU congregations around the world. And so this is the second part in our series on international Unitarian Universalism. And we're going to be looking today at the church in Asia. So many years ago, back in 1887, the first Unitarian congregation began in the Khasi Hills of northeast India. Now we, that is Ontario Unitarians, actually have not one, but two core connections to this group in a very remote part of India. It's up in the northeast. It's an agrarian area close to Bhutan and Bangladesh. And in fact, this is an area that's not Hindu. They had a local indigenous religion that believed in a creator God. And so this area became Christian when they got colonized by the British, and they focused on, this is a tea growing area. And Methodists, it was hard to get to, so the only missionaries who managed to make their way through the hills to get there were Welsh Methodists. And so a young man, Hajam Kisar Singh, was brought up in Methodism, being taught by these Welsh missionaries in the 1860s and 70s. Now, this is a fairly stern Methodism. They tended to emphasize the sort of depravity of human nature and spoke a lot about internal hellfire. Now, Singh read the Bible for himself as a teen, and he was drawn to the kinder teachings of Jesus. And he began to question this theology of salvation and hellfire, very similar to what European Unitarians did during the Reformation, or when they began reading the Bible for themselves. Singh read the Bible and he thought that Jesus was saying he cared about how we lived, not what we believed, and wanted people to just take care of each other. And as this curious and outspoken teenager, he looked for like-minded people, and eventually he was directed to the Reverend Charles Dahl, who was the only Unitarian missionary in all of India. He'd been based in Calcutta since 1855, so this was 10-20 years later. Now, Reverend Dahl worked with a Hindu group that was aligned with Unitarian values. He advocated for a lot of social reform and education, but he hadn't ever really established a formal church in India. So Dahl and Singh began writing to one another because, again, Singh is in such a remote area of India, it's very difficult to get to, so they just corresponded. And Dahl sent him the writings of William Ellery Channing, Harriet Martineau, and other Unitarian prominent thinkers of the time. And Singh was just inspired to find this existing religion that fit his own sense of what Jesus was really preaching. So at the age of 20, he founded the Khasi Unitarian Church in 1887 in his own home. It was he and 3 other people. And they created their own faith statement. They believed in the unity of God, the fatherhood and motherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and in love, union, worship, and faith, and in immortality. Now, Singh did not become a minister, but he supported throughout his life the development of the church with a great sense of purpose. He used all his own earnings from his work and poured them into the church. He wrote hymns and had the Bible printed in the local Khasi language. And so by the turn of the century, a few hundred people were part of this new Unitarian religion that posited a loving God and a loving people. Now, Reverend Charles Dahl died in 1887, and so Singh by that point was connected with more Unitarians around the world, and he found a lot of support from the Reverend Jabez Sunderland, who was editing a Unitarian magazine in the United States, and he featured updates from Khasi in this magazine. And Sunderland went to India in the late 1890s, and he traveled all the way up to the Khasi Hills to meet Singh. And he wrote back to people in the States. Everywhere I saw evidences, sincerity, consecration, and warm attachment to the religious faith which people had felt had done so much for them. This whole movement is unique in the fact that it has sprung from the soil. Both Dahl and Sutherland supported Singh in establishing this Khasi Unitarian tradition in this remote part of India that combined both sort of this mixture of Khasi beliefs and Unitarian beliefs. But they were also instrumental in establishing the Ontario Unitarian tradition. So we actually have the same roots. Because like Singh, people here were determined to hear the word of the Lord in a way that spoke to their conscience. And in the early 1850s, Charles Dahl was the first settled minister at the fledgling First Unitarian Church of Toronto. And this was because they couldn't get a British Unitarian minister to come. So they said, okay, we'll get somebody from the States. And Charles came up and became their minister. And he was there for 3 years. And his sermons and work really got the congregation established with membership and financial stability, because up until then it had just been a small lay group. And so during his time, the congregation went from sort of a flimsy wooden building to building a substantial stone church. The Dahl fell out with lead congregation member Joseph Workman over a financial dispute around the mortgage of the building. And so Dahl left. And at that point, Dahl then returned to the States, and he was sent to India to be the missionary there. And so he spent the rest of his life in India promoting Unitarian ideals and eventually connecting with that passionate, eager teenage boy from rural Northeast India. And then after Jabez Sutherland visited that same dedicated man in rural India many years later, he returned and became the minister at First Toronto in 1901. And Sutherland became a really well-known figure. His public talks in Toronto drew such crowds that the police actually showed up and complained about the dangers of overcrowding. He was a really passionate speaker and writer, and so after 5 years, he decided to leave and return to the States so that he had more time to write and lecture. And in fact, Sutherland, after his experiences in India and with Singh and the Khasi Unitarians, he spent many years speaking out and critiquing the British rule of India. And in fact, he corresponded with Pandey. So Dahl, Sutherland, Singh, and the Khasi Hill Unitarians are such a clear reminder that we're all connected and interdependent. We may rise in different soil, but we come from common roots. That Khasi Unitarian tradition, like ours, is a fusion of common theology and local culture. There's almost 10,000 members in over 45 congregations, so it's actually larger than our Canadian denomination. In fact, they're the third largest body of Unitarians in the world. And it's an impoverished area, and so local Unitarians are very active in promoting education, and they've built several schools to help children there and try and get them to rise out of poverty. Sundays, they hold up to 4 services. It's an all-day long affair. They sing more than they sermonize. Children participate fully, and they talk a lot more about God. But it's a very Unitarian Universalist God. Heaven and hell are something we create for ourselves here on earth. It's not divine reward and punishment. If we live well, we live with loving concerns for others, we will receive that in return. If we create justice, we will find justice. So the Khasis believe, as we do, that people must try to live and create a good and meaningful life for themselves and others. And they light a chalice at the beginning of every service, just like we do. We are interconnected and interdependent, grown from the same root, even as we are continents apart. The ministers who influence our Unitarian tradition also influence theirs. They are because we are because they are. In places like Tokyo and Hong Kong, there are small sort of Western expatriate fellowships that meet once a month. So if you went to Tokyo, you could go meet other Unitarians there. But Indonesia and the Philippines actually have networks of organized churches. Not so long ago, in fact, in the mid-1990s, the Unitarian Christian Church of Indonesia was founded. And it was formed by Christians who desired, again, to follow more closely the teachings of Jesus. And so that church, which provided the meditation today, consists of about 500 people in 4 churches. The Jaggi Church, as they are known, believes that God is the only God. They preach from the Bible, but rather than celebrating Christian holidays, they actually feel like they've returned to their roots, so they celebrate the Jewish holy days. They also respect the freedom of each person to determine their faith, and they reject all forms of coercion and violence in the name of religion. Our theology springs from the same roots. And as we've heard, the first Universalist church in the Philippines was established when we were established. And Kamada worked tirelessly to promote that idea of a loving God and universal salvation in his country. And he planted small congregations around the islands. And unfortunately, just when Reverend Kamada was preparing to travel to the US, because he had also linked into the Unitarian Universalist Association, and they were going to accept the Philippines into formal membership with them, he was actually killed by a right-wing paramilitary group because of his justice work supporting local farmers. Again, this was a very impoverished area, and he was working for farmers' rights and people's rights, and he was killed because of that work. His daughter, the Reverend Rebecca Kamada, continued his work, and in fact, she only retired 2 years ago, and Reverend Heath, who was at the beginning of the video, is now the head of the Philippine Church. So they have 27 congregations and about 2,000 members. And their tagline is many beliefs, one faith in love, one hope in humanity. Because the parts of Philippines where they are largely rural and impoverished, although there is a couple of congregations in Manila, farmers are a significant part of their membership. The services are all ages, are held in these open air chapels with a lot of singing and dancing. And UUCP has actually also added an additional principle to the 7 UUA principles. Their first principle is, there is God, God is love. And my colleague, the Reverend Diane Rowland, visited the Philippines in 2012, and she noted, I met whole communities of people that live without electricity and running water, for whom medical care can be too distant and too expensive to obtain. And yet they welcomed me with open arms and the warmth of their friendship, proudly offering handmade gifts and their favorite foods. They are Unitarian Universalists struggling to stay alive in a religiously conservative Catholic country. They treasure their relationships with other UUs, and our connections are vital to their spiritual survival. Currently, the UUCP are developing income-generating projects like a mango farm to give them needed financial stability. Because this church also sponsors education for young people to help them out of poverty, and LGBTQ+ rights and the climate crisis are top priorities for the people in their congregations. Sadly, last December, Typhoon Ray roared into the Philippines and hit particularly hard the set of islands like Negros where the UUs are. And so it destroyed their homes, their crops, and their livestock. And the work of rebuilding will take them a long time. UUs around the world have been asked to help if they can. You can't give directly to their church, but you can give through the International Convocation of UU Women, and you just tag your donation as Aid for the UU Church of the Philippines. And the International Convocation is another organization that connects UU women around the world, particularly in justice and advocacy work. You can Google them, and I'll put the details on Facebook and in next week's show. Like the Khasi Unitarians in India, this church is based in a rural area, serving agrarian people living with poverty and limited education opportunities. And that's really a big contrast to UUs of North America, which are based mostly in cities, serving well-educated middle-class people for the most part, who have so many advantages. And yet, despite those cultural and social economic differences, we have sprung from the same root. People reading the Bible and seeing the unity of God, seeing Jesus' teachings as focused on people just caring for one another. We come from people who experienced God as all-loving, who fiercely rejected the idea that God would send people to hell for all eternity. These ideas sprouted up in Europe, in North America, in India, in Indonesia, Philippines, all around the world. When people think and feel for themselves, when they're able to read their spiritual teachings and think them through, these are the beliefs that grow in their hearts. All of us, all over the world, have found meaning in this free faith, comfort in the whole and loving nature of God, in the sacred beauty of the earth and the universe, holding on steadfastly to the belief that people can and will choose to take care of one another. It matters how we live here and now. And this is the root of Unitarianism and Universalism and Unitarian Universalism. A faith in people caring for people, growing in the soil of local cultures, flowering in unique ways, but always rooted in love, in hope, and in one another. So say we all.